Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Featured guest today is Robert Earl Stewart. Can we call you Bob?
You can, yes.
Okay. Robert Earl Stewart's first collection of poetry, Something Burned Along the Southern Border, was shortlisted for the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award. His poems have been published in journals in Canada, the US, and Great Britain. In 2010, he received the Windsor Endowment for the Arts Grant for Emerging Artists in Literary Arts. His poetry has appeared in magazines, journals, and anthologies in Canada, the US, and the UK, including this, Magma Poetry, Poetry Superhighway, Nthposition, Monday Night, Iota, Moosehead Anthology, and the Best Canadian Poetry of 2012. In 2018, he was nominated for a Canadian Magazine Award for an article he wrote about a pro wrestling role-playing game that he co-created as a teenager. He has been a journalist and has spent time as a creative writing instructor, photography instructor, a CBC radio book panelist, and the manager of a bookshop. He lives in Windsor with his wife and their 3 children. Robert Earl Stewart's new book, Running Shaped Hole, will be published by Dundurn Press in spring 2022. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
You touch on this in your book, but do you remember a time when you didn't write?
Yes, I remember. Actually, I can tell you about a period. I took first year creative writing at the University of Windsor in 1993. It was my first year of university, and I took the 2 introductory creative writing courses at the University of Windsor, and I did not excel at it. I can say that, and the reason, I think, is because I wasn't ready. I wasn't well enough read to be a creative writer, even though I was a voracious reader. And I think I realized about myself in like this strange moment of maturity, that I wasn't ready for this, that I hadn't read enough things, and I wasn't enjoying it. And I also wasn't willing to do the work of writing. I wanted to crank out something and hand it in and get an A. I didn't want to get it back and revise it and send it back to the workshop and get it back and revise it, send it back to the work. I didn't want to go through any of that. It was impatient. So basically, after that year, I decided I'm not doing creative writing anymore. I'm just doing straight, I'm just going to be an English major and focus on the reading and the canon, learning, all the things that English majors learn. And I basically didn't write for maybe about 5 years until I was in grad school. And I just, I read and I learned. And when I finally got around to writing again, it was short stories, but I was much more patient and willing to change things, and had a better grasp of what story is, had a better grasp of dialogue. And, just 5 years of maturity is a lot when you go from 20 to 25. That's a big gap. So that's, a fairly recent period of not writing, but reading. And when I taught creative writing, I often tried to enforce on the students, and this was at through the City of Windsor Parks and Rec Department at Mackenzie Hall. I did that for a few years. That one of the skills they need to learn as writers, if there's anything I can impart to these people as writers, that they leave here with a new skill, let's say, it's that they should be readers. It's almost more important to read a lot than to write a lot. And I've always thought that. So I really believe in the power of of reading if you're going to write. So
You're a journalist, a musician, an author, and a photographer, and a dad. How do you carve out time for writing in the midst of all of that? And do you have a particular routine to keep yourself on track?
Certainly not a routine. No, I don't prescribe to any kind of rigid daily schedule of anything, as a matter of fact. And I guess one of the easiest ways to do that is that I don't write as a journalist anymore. I'm not employed as a journalist anymore, and haven't been for about 7 years. I did that for 15 years, but I left the newspapers in 2014. And other than like playing guitar by myself in my office at night, I don't, being in a band is not part of my life anymore. And although those are two big things that inform, they're talked about extensively in The Running Shaped Whole, and they certainly, the journalism in particular plays a part in my poetry. But they, if you eliminate those two things, I'm a photographer, a writer, and a dad, and a runner. So the running takes up a lot of time too. I was just out for a run this morning for about an hour. But it's I'm very blessed that I am able to work here at home and kind of be the the person who's at home during the day. Our kids are grown. They're teenagers, and but I'm able to do the things that I need to do to not only be happy but to get work done. But I don't obsess about if a day or two goes by and I haven't written anything. I don't think I'm failing, and I don't think that I'm not living up to other people's expectations. I do know people who preach a rigorous daily schedule of writing, and if that works for them, that's great. But I know that doesn't work for me. And like I just said earlier, when I'm not writing, I'm reading, and that's a lot of the work, is doing the reading of whatever it is: contemporary fiction, essays, poetry. So.
You lived in Montreal for a time, but came back home, mainly for love, it seems. What impact does your connection to life in Windsor, Essex County have on your poetry and your prose?
Well, I always tell people that Windsor, I always kind of refer to it as Canada's smallest big city. We all seem to know each other. People who, when I go out to the mall or to grocery stores, I'm always running into people I know. You can tack on 40 minutes every time I leave the house because I'm going to see people I know. And I think that's something about this part of Canada that gets left off of our map sometimes, is that there's a vibrancy here, but it's a strange one. It's not like Toronto. It's not like Montreal. It's not like Vancouver. In my opinion, it's more like Detroit, or it's more like Buffalo, New York, or even parts of New York City, like Queens. Or Cleveland is another city I would compare it to. There's a rougher edge. And in my opinion, we're a little more real. And maybe that's just the relativism of that this is where I'm from, so this is what's real to me. But I was just having a conversation with somebody yesterday. We were talking about Toronto, and I like Toronto, and I go to Toronto when it's, I haven't been there in a few years, but I do like Toronto. But when I'm in Toronto, I always feel like I'm in a foreign city. I feel like I'm not someone who's from here. When I go to Detroit, I feel like I'm in another neighborhood of the city I grew up in. So it's, Windsor has a reputation outside of, when I was in grad school in Montreal, I was the butt of a lot of jokes about being the hick from Windsor. And I'm like, I don't know how, there's like 250,000 people there. I don't think it's something that it's not a backwater. I don't live in, in an area that you could even consider close to being rural. It's a city, it's a large city. With, it has a university, it has massive factories, it has, small outlying suburbs. So I just think Windsor gets the short end of the stick a lot. But maybe that's our strength too. I kind of like the fact that it's, people from Windsor know, I think, what we have. And if you don't know that, I think you should get out there and explore it and figure it out, because it's, I never want to leave here. I don't have aspirations even to leave this house. I'm not looking to move anywhere. We're in Walkerville and I like it here. I grew up here, and this is where I want to stay. So I don't know if that answered the question, but
was a glorious answer.
As your first two books were poetry, was it tempting to try to tell your running story in poetic form, or did you know it would have to be a memoir?
I wasn't running when I did the poetry. That was actually, when I was, when I weighed close to 400 pounds. It was when I was, there's a story in The Running Shaped Hole about the day I wrote my first poem. And I was sitting right out, there's a door right here, and I was sitting right out there in the backyard in an inflatable pool. And it was our son's second birthday, I believe. And, that was the only place I would go to swim, because I was so ashamed, and I always want to couch this in that, body positivity, and that, how I feel is not how I think everyone should feel. And I have nothing but compassion and acceptance for people who struggle with all kinds of eating, weight, and body issues. But for me at that time, I was so I would not, go swimming anywhere that wasn't my own backyard where no one could see me. And even out there, I was wearing a shirt, in my own backyard while I was swimming. So when I was writing poetry, I was still very much locked in that sedentary lifestyle that journalism certainly didn't help, where you're sitting all day in front of a computer, talking on the phone, sometimes for 6 or 8 hours at a stretch without even standing up, and eating at your desk and eating in the car. But one of the interesting things I found later, I didn't start running until 2012 when I was 39 years old, is that when I look back at the poetry, there's a lot of strange, and we were thinking about incorporating this into The Running Shaped Hole, maybe as epigraphs at the top of each chapter, but we opted not to do it. But there was all these references in my own poetry to running, to this weird kind of dreamlike freedom of running and moving through the wilderness. There's a poem about me wearing a cat costume and becoming the leader of a band of stray cats that was in the neighborhood here, and joining them on the hunt at night and running through the neighborhood and kind of becoming their leader. And it had that dreamlike quality of like when you have a dream where you can fly, or a dream where you are falling or running faster than humanly possible for some reason. But I was writing this stuff at a time when my whole life revolved around not running. I would take great pains to make sure I never had to run anywhere, because I couldn't. It was probably dangerous to try. And but yet my poetry was filled with all these images of those things. Lots of animals that run too, like deer. There's lots of deer for some reason in certain poems, and people chasing me in certain poems. So looking back, I think somewhere inside there was that running shaped hole that was there that I needed to fill. It hadn't been filled yet, and it was that yearning, like a spiritual yearning to, to find that thing that was going to fill the hole. And it took some time. It was a lot, like a lot of big decisions, you can't make them until you're in enough pain that the decision is made for you almost. So there was a lot of pain before I got to the running.
So the title of the book owes a bit to Christopher Hitchens, Pascal, and our mutual friend, Martin Deck, right? Yes. Can you tell us briefly how that came about?
Yes. When Christopher Hitchens died in about 2011, I believe, and if you don't know who he is, he's a brilliant literary critic from England. He was also a very staunch, aggressive atheist. And when he died, a poet friend or someone in the Canlit community in Toronto put something on Facebook that said, please, in the comments below, please put your the greatest thing that Christopher Hitchens ever taught you. And I put, Christopher Hitchens taught me that it's possible to be a brilliant literary mind and critic and also be completely wrong about spirituality, God, religion, and faith. And within minutes, I had people who had been at my book launches in Toronto and I had corresponded with over a number of years about poetry and Canadian literature, denouncing my work in the comments below this and just saying, wow, we thought we knew you. We thought you were smart. We thought you were cool. Turns out you're, some kind of religious nutcase who, disagrees with the great luminary Christopher Hitchens. And some of those people I've never talked to since. It's been a decade and they're just gone out of my life. And so this argument kind of ensued as they do on Facebook, particularly in the Canlit scene. And, you get sucked in and you feel like you have to defend yourself, and then you're saying things you don't want to say. And Martin Deck, who is the greatest bookseller, certainly in Windsor, he was watching this unfold, not saying anything, just reading the comments. And he back channeled me and he just said, he commiserated with me. And he said, it just goes to show you that there's people out there who don't know that the whole is God-shaped. And I'd never heard this before. And I was struck by the profundity of what Martin had just said. And I wrote it down in a notebook. And a few years later, when I'm now writing The Running Shaped Hole and looking for a title, I was kind of writing a list of possible titles and kind of riffing on things. And I got to The Running Shaped Vacuum or something like that. And then I was like, what was that thing that Martin said that day? And I went and I looked through my notebooks and I found it. And I was like, The Running Shaped Hole. The God-shaped hole, the running shaped hole. And I'm like, that's perfect. So in the book, I tell this story about how Martin supplied the title. And when I told him, I said, you've given me the title for my book. It's called The Running Shaped Hole. And it's after that thing you said when Christopher Hitchens died. And then there was that argument on Facebook. And you said the God-shaped hole. And he says, yeah, but that's just Blaise Pascal. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, that's Pascal. It's from the Pensée. It's like, just go look it up. So I went and, of course, found the book. And now I knew who Pascal was. I just, wasn't widely read in Pascal and didn't know that phrase. So the passage that it's from the Pensée is now the epigraph to the book. So that's the little story. So thank you, Christopher Hitchens. God bless you, Christopher Hitchens. How about that?
Okay. In Running Shaped Hole, you also mentioned the connection that your writing process has to the running, while also working on meditation. You say, when I'm running, I'm somewhere else interiorly. You also mentioned the concept of a place within the self. Could you expand on how those ideas affect your writing?
Yeah. When I realized that, if you've ever driven for a long distance on the 401, well, any highway, but I imagine all of us have experienced this on the 401, you'll get to that point where suddenly you are like, my God, how long have I not been even thinking? It seems like I haven't even been thinking. It's been 40 minutes. We've traveled 100 kilometers. I don't even remember anything happening. And I found that was happening to me when I started running. And I think it's a combination of things. It's the obvious increase in respirations of the breath, the creation of the endorphins in the brain, and that, kind of, dissolve through your system. And for me, it's also the visual stimulation of being out in the city. I can't run on treadmills. I can't run on tracks. One of the things that running does for me is there's almost like a hypnotic rhythm of things passing by in my periphery. And I realize that on certain days, not every run, but certain runs, and I can tell you that the run I had this morning was one of them, you enter that phase where you aren't thinking of anything. You're not worried. You're not scheduling things in your head of like, oh, I got to do this today, then I got to do that. You're not working out problems. You're just running. And, I sometimes worry about that. Like, you can just run out into the middle of Ottawa Street and not really think about what you're doing. But so like any good meditation, from what I've learned over the years is that, it's not about forcing yourself to stop thinking. It's not about, forcing ideas away. It's just about kind of acknowledging and accepting them as they come and not latching on and letting them go. So when I return from a run, it's not that I have a whole bunch of ideas or a whole bunch of things to say or, a whole bunch of problems worked out. But what I have done is, and this is where I say, like, it's kind of like I've kind of entered that running shaped hole. I've kind of found it. It's like it's out there and I have to like go search for it like a portal, and you almost like go through it and you're in it and you exist there for a time as like it's like a different place. I feel like I've gone somewhere else and come back when I arrive back at the front door. And so yeah, in that place, I've just created some freedom to not be consumed with like day-to-day things. And then when you sit down to write later, you have like an energy, you've had a reprieve from other things that, allow you to focus, to get it down on paper or on the screen. So it's not like I'm doing writing in my head while I'm running. I'm just trying to, be open and receptive, and hopefully achieve some kind of state of blankness at the same time. So, yeah.
What do you most hope that readers will take away from this book, from Running Shape Hole?
Yeah, I've thought about that because I know that I'm going to be answering, that will come up, as we do like press things for the book next year and publicity things. I was very conscious of making sure it was never going to be marketed as a sports book. It's not, and it's not a how-to book about running. It doesn't include any, real hard pointers or advice about running. We were very conscious about not putting any running imagery on the cover of the book. If you've seen the cover, it actually has a donut on the front of it. and the donut has 2 bites out of it. It looks like a very quintessentially Simpsons-esque donut, like the classic round donut with a hole in it with like purpley pink icing and sprinkles. And I didn't ask for that. That was the cover designer, Laura Boyle at Dundurn Press, who came up with that. And I was delighted because I'm a Simpsons fan. But I also like the fact that it had 2 bites out of it, which seems like strangely obsessive and excessive. And I told her, I said, I love that there's no running imagery on the front of this book. And I love the donut, and I love that there's 2 bites out of the donut. And I said, the only thing more Bob Stewart than 2 bites out of a donut is no donut, and just crumbs. That's, and I want people to I think it's a funny book. I hope it's a funny book. I think humor is the most difficult thing to sustain in writing. I am very cognizant of the Leacock Medal. I covet the Leacock Medal, maybe above all awards. And I know we had Heidi Jacobs, our local writer, who won the Leacock for her very funny book. And I think humor that's why most funny movies fail, is because I think they can't sustain the humor. So I think being able to sustain the humor throughout the book was something I was really conscious of. So I want people to be able to read it and just find it a compelling, funny, but also moving story. You don't have to be a runner. You don't even have to want to run. There are days when I don't want to run. And, I run basically every other day, but not every day is a delight. There's days when it's a struggle to even get out the door. And mostly the struggle isn't physical. The struggle is in the head. And I think that's an important thing that people who are maybe coming to this book, should know, that there's a lot of, it's about recovery. It's about faith. It's about spirituality. It's about being a dad and a husband. And, running just happens to be how I connect with a lot of those things. So it's about writing. It's about rock and roll too. It's about Windsor. It's about Detroit, Montreal, all those places appear. So
Bob, what's your next project? And are you still writing poetry?
I am writing poetry, but it doesn't come the way it used to. The first 2 books of poetry, the one that came out in 2009, Something Burned Along the Southern Border, and then Campfire Radio Rhapsody in 2011, they're basically, I realize now that they are just 2 books that came out of the same creative period. I'm very happy with them. I like them. I know other people like them. But there wasn't a great leap between them. They're basically very similar in a way. And so I got to this point where I was to write my 3rd book of poetry, and I was getting competing advice from poets and CanLit people. And there was a certain school of thought, you could almost call it the Toronto poetry scene school of thought, where it's like, your next book has to have a rigorous thesis. It has to be about an issue. It needs to have academic rigor. It has to be something that furthers a cause almost. It almost had to take on a political, life. And all these causes that people suggested to me were, meritorious causes. They were all good things. But I didn't feel it. It was like being told to, it was like being assigned the subject of your next book of poetry. It's going to be about, whether it was environmental issues or cultural, social issues. So I kind of heard that side of the story. And then there was another side of the story that was, people were just like, your next book is your next book. Whatever it is. Don't worry about it. Just write the poems. And that seemed more me than the other side of things. But at the same time, I felt kind of bored with, because I'd written 2 books that were very much the same. I felt thwarted, I guess, blocked up, and I kind of, fortunately, the opportunity to write The Running Shaped Hole came along, and that has kind of filled up the last few years of working on that. And every once in a while, a poem will occur, and I always say that's the great thing about poetry, is that you can be sitting in a coffee shop somewhere, and with your notebook, as long as you have your notebook and a pen, you're okay. You can write, you can get the basis of a poem down. When I'm working on The Running Shaped Hole, or I have a project going that's older than my oldest child. It's like I started writing a novel in 2001. So that is actually the next thing. That is the thing that I'm working on. As soon as, and it seems like every few weeks I have some little thing to do with The Running Shaped Hole, proofs, helping with the marketing and things like that. So I'm not getting too much into the novel, in fits and starts, because this project, The Running Shaped Hole, is still kind of active. But when I'm writing prose, I kind of find I have to be rooted in my office at my desk, because there's multiple notebooks open. There's the stack of old manuscripts that's scribbled all over. Poetry, I find, is just something in a notebook like this, and the other stuff is too vast to carry the show on the road. I'd have to pull up in my van in front of a coffee shop and unload all the things I need to work on a novel there. So, but the novel, which is now 19 years in the making, is technically the next thing. So,
would you like to read a little bit for our listeners?
Yes, I have something prepared here it's from chapter 9 of The Running Shaped Hole. And that chapter is called The Forest of Paternal Dismay, A Night in the Black Oak. And just the black, well, it explains itself. So I'll just begin. Not to overstate anything or be too dramatic, but on a cold winter's night just before Christmas 2013, a plot of ancient old-growth forest on the banks of the Detroit River almost became my Gethsemane. On that night, I left the warm confines of our family home on Moy Avenue, dressed in my winter running gear, and drove to the desolate southwest corner of Windsor to Black Oak Heritage Park. I'd gone from nearly housebound, imprisoned by self-consciousness and fear because of my weight, to someone who went out in the dead of night, in the dead of winter, to test his physical limits. Trail running was good for that. Trail running in a polar vortex was even better. The small gravel lot at the entrance to the park was deserted when I pulled in. Stepping out into the night air, I felt the cold immediately penetrating the thin layers of my running tights and jacket. I donned my running gloves and toque, and, fussing to fit my phone into one of my jacket's small pockets, opted to leave it in the van and run without my running app tracking my progress. The running magazines and gurus often touted the occasional technology-free run. I knew it would take me just over an hour to travel the roughly 10 kilometers of looping trails that are packed into the Black Oak's 100 hectares before emerging from the trees into the safe confines of the parking lot. The best way to activate the moisture-wicking and heat-retaining tech fibers of my winter gear was to get moving. So I shut the van door, zipped up my jacket, pulled my merino wool buff over the lower half of my face, and set out on this solitary race against myself, my weight, my appetite, my nature, my fears. A wood chip path led through an open savanna into the forest proper, and once you were in amongst the old growth forest, the trails narrowed to the width of footfalls and began to loop deviously around the densely packed trees. It was one of those nights when the air is so cold and still that you can hear the crystalline tinkling of the snow. I turned on my headlamp, which illuminated an orb about 10 meters in front of me. But in the winding dark of Black Oak, I had little choice but to keep my gaze locked on the trail, a black ribbon of compacted earth that ran through the snow-white woods, just a meter or so in front of me. Soon, the clicking of the snow and the snapping of the branches disappeared from my consciousness, and all I could hear was my breath and my footfalls. The trail emerges from the forest at one point and crosses a second savanna behind the towering silos of the dainty rice plant. At another point, it drops down into a dry gulch that, when it's possible to get surer footing, you can clear with a single leap. The wild natural world of the wood is divided by a rail line, which passes through the park, bisecting it from east to west, and terminates at the towering grain elevators and derricks of the Morton Terminal at the river's edge, just beyond the Black Oak's southern reach. Although this was my first time running in Black Oak at night, it was maybe my 10th time there in the past 2 months, so I was familiar with the trail. I hit all the now familiar landmarks and vistas at all the expected intervals. Running in Black Oak offers definite physical benefits, varied cardio conditioning resulting from the wide variety of terrain encountered, and the building of stabilizing muscles in the feet and ankles as a result of the frequent tight turns. Running there also brought me a lot of peace. The trunks of trees constantly passing in the periphery, providing a trance-like visual stimulus that made the time spent winding through the hardwood, pushing myself toward exhaustion, slip by. And the truly great thing about running in Black Oak was that as long as you stay on the trail, if you commit to the path, it always loops back around to the parking lot. You don't really have to worry about where exactly you are. If you trust in the path, it will lead you home. And then I ran full tilt into a deer. Sensing its presence at the last second, I looked up into the headlamp illuminated trail in front of me and saw it standing there, a large buck with a menacing rack. It was too late to stop. I let out a heaving grunt as I collided with its flank and hindquarters. It barely moved. We stood inches apart, staring at each other in the cold gray light of the lamp, our breath intermingling in the beam. He held taut his pose on the trail, seemingly still convinced I could not see him despite our recent collision. He scraped a black slash in the trail with a hoof, snorted once, and went arcing off through the frosty foliage. There was a snapping of branches and the briefest rustling of brittle leaves, and then all was quiet again. I looked down at my body. The lamplight revealed a fine coating of deer hair glinting on my black running tights, fawn against the neon green and royal blue of my running jacket. It was hard to say how long I stood there, more enchanted than startled from my run-in with the deer, but it was probably less than 30 seconds. I knew I was about 40 minutes and roughly 6.5 kilometers into my run, about 25 minutes out from the van. The temperature was dropping. It was supposed to hit minus 20 degrees Celsius that night. It was time to get moving. And I will just intercede here and say now from here, I proceed to get disastrously lost. The book goes into, some detail about that, but I realize I'm lost when I basically collide with a fence. I have a second collision. This time it's with a fence. And I realize I am not where I think I am. I thought I knew where I was. And here I am touting, if you stay on the path, it leads you home. But now I'm lost and it's nighttime, it's freezing, and I'm at a part of the park that I realize because I'm now down near Morton Terminal. I'm at the very southwest corner of Black Oak, where I thought I was almost back at the parking lot. So colliding with the deer, I realized, may have resulted in me inadvertently stepping onto an adjacent loop of the trail, virtually indistinguishable even in broad daylight from the loop of the trail I had been on just prior to impact. Then, when I had continued on my way, I was inadvertently heading into unfamiliar territory, traveling deeper into the woods than I had ever ventured before. As panic rose in my chest and the temperature continued to plummet, I tried to come to terms with the long run that was ahead of me if I wanted to get back to the van. Should I head back the way I had come, if I actually knew which direction that was, knowing that that was an hour's run? Or should I continue the way I'd been going? Was that less than an hour back to the parking lot? Did it even lead there at all? What if I just left the section of trail I was standing on and stepped over onto the loop that passed a few feet to my right? Would I be slashing 25 minutes off my efforts to get back to the warmth and safety of the van? Or would I be tacking on a heedless slog into the winter dawn in what I was beginning to think of as my desperate pursuit of survival? I don't remember what caused me to make the decision I made, but I found myself running again in what I figured was the direction I had been traveling when I was stopped by the fence. My hands ached from the cold seeping into my running gloves. Beneath my buff, partially frozen from my exhalations, my nose and cheeks burned. My toes could have been missing inside my shoes for all I could feel of them. Added to this, the guiding light of my headlamp was starting to flicker, its candle power fading as the cold sapped the batteries. And my decision to go tech-free on this run was starting to look like the kind of tragic final decision people whisper about in small groups at funerals. Except it wasn't me I was worried about. My worry was focused on Jennifer and the kids, who would doubtless be worried sick about my having left the house for a run after supper and not returning. My thoughts raced beyond my control, and soon I was envisioning a police cruiser gliding to a halt in front of the house, 2 constables approaching the door, caps in hand, Jennifer collapsing to her knees in the exact spot I had been kneeling to retrieve that Luke Skywalker action figure from under the piano when I learned my mother was dead. The children gradually catching on that their father was gone, perished in a woodlot, found frozen in a deer abandoned hollow, a victim of exposure, but apparently also having been kicked and gored to death by an aggressive buck. This was the never-ending sadness I had inflicted on them through my hubris, the enduring, lifelong absence of their husband and father right when he was finally getting his eating and weight under control. I had ruined their lives. My selfish, adventure-seeking behavior, this newfound obsession with running, had led me back into the center of their lives and then straight out again, petering out after ricocheting around like an entropic bullet in one of the country's most historically and ecologically significant stands of oak. I had failed them again. I had strayed from the path. Inadvertently or no, it spelled certain doom. More than once, I stopped listening for traffic, the conveyors of the terminal, the baying of hounds, the call of my rescuers, summoned by my frantic wife, desperate for my safe return. I have no idea how long I ran. Hours had passed, surely. My spatial and directional sense were confounded by the black oak. The phone I had opted to leave in the van rather than fuss with had a GPS compass, mapping apps, and a flashlight. It was also obviously a telephone, which I could have used to call for help. I could have called home to say goodbye. If I live, I will never leave my phone behind again, I promised myself. If I live, I will make my family proud of me. I will make them proud of my running. I will write a book about it. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if I made it.
What an incredible excerpt. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you for joining us.
Thank
Robert.
you very much. It is a pleasure.
So when can we look forward to reading your book? When will it be out?
The release date is February 22nd, 2022. So it's a spring 2022 launch. And that's with Dundurn Press.
All right. Thank you again for joining us. It was great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.